Bend Around the Wind by Skylia. Chapter 93, Battle Royale, Part 1. They barely set foot in the dark abandoned city that towered over the land to know that this was not going to be easy. The other's ship was hovering in the distance, only visible because of the golden shield protecting it. If not for that, it would have been completely obscured by the dirty fog that seemed to be everywhere. Stark really could have warned them about it, but maybe he just didn't notice he wasn't in his suit after all. The fog clung to him like a second skin, an itchy, sticky second skin. Not much of his skin was exposed, but it was enough to drive him crazy. Bucky was so very glad that Steve convinced him to wear a mask. They did not need it technically, because the atmosphere was good enough for humans, but Jarvis mentioned heavy pollution in the city, and Steve was immediately adamant about opening up their care packages. Care packages. Steve hated it when he called them that. Fury sent them some nice high-tech equipment in big, heavy shield crates delivered by Natasha herself. It didn't happen often, but once in a while before they went on a mission, S.H.I.E.L.D. showed up with useful stuff. Steve was not sure where to put the gesture this time, and neither was Bucky. Fury was either trying to play nice again to smooth things over between S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers, or it was his way of approving this journey without actually approving of it. It didn't actually matter at this moment. Also, free stuff. So yeah, high-tech masks and goggles. The weight of them on his face was all too familiar, both comforting him and making him a little sick to the stomach. But that was nothing new. He felt like that every time he used a weapon that reminded him a little too much of the past. He kept glancing at Steve's back to remind himself who he was following. S.H.I.E.L.D. may have given them some extra stuff, but they still decided to go old school. No jumping out of the flying spaceship like all the others. No, they waited until they landed and stayed away from the main battle zone, where Thor was decimating the attacking robot tanks and War Machine was blowing up turret after turret. They were doing more than well. The Hulk was not even needed yet. Bruce was sitting on the ship, not wanting to deprive Stark of any help he might need taking down the other's barrier. They had enough muzzle power to face what was around them so far. This was why Bucky had a bad feeling about the whole thing. Call him pessimistic, but he just knew that this was not going to go so smoothly for long. It never did. So when they finally arrived to the abandoned city, he didn't even have it in him to curse as things started to light up around them like light switches being flipped on one after another. It was not a sudden meteorite shower. They were not streetlights or windows that lit up, not even big neon advertisements. No, lights shone down on them from every direction like thousands of golden eyes. He had his gun in his hand even before Steve shouted for them to take cover. The automatic guns shooting at them were a problem. The random cannons that activated via motion sensors were a bigger problem. The flying robots swarming around them like mosquitoes that did not have a good sip of blood in centuries were the biggest problem. The little beasts were not even as big as a human head, but they were dangerous. Whoever invented them was hopefully rotting in hell. Or whatever the alien equivalent of it was around here. Aim for the belly, Steve suggested via radio. Bucky shot down a few of the things from his hiding spot, then watched how the smaller Skrull girl, B, smashed one to pieces on the pavement, her arm shaped like a hammer. Not like Thor's, but similar enough. I think she has a good enough technique, Bucky commented. He lost track of the other girl, but she probably would have said something if she were in danger. So Bucky assumed she was fine and giving these things hell. You were supposed to be silent, Cap, Stark said. That's so funny, coming from you, Bucky answered before Steve could. Well, that didn't burn out, Steve said to Stark. So we're going to improvise now. So what's the new plan? A female voice asked, and it took Bucky a moment to decide whether it was B or Juyu. He guessed Juyu. If I may, Captain Rogers, Jarvis interrupted, my scans indicate a large amount of underground tunnels directly beneath the city. It may provide a suitable way for you to move forward. That would have been good to know beforehand, Steve said. My apologies, Captain, the AI said, but just like with the city itself, I was unable to pick up any readings from the area before the emanating energy signatures spiked, then stabilized. I suspected either the city's standard defenses or the technology the other utilized may have something to do with it.
Okay, it doesn't matter, just give us directions.
Bucky was suddenly yelling because a bigger swarm of robots found him and he had to leave his little safe spot. Jarvis did, as Bucky started running.
So these things do run on electricity, right?
He asked as he glanced back at the things flying at him.
There were too many of them to shoot them down one by one.
That is correct, Jarvis answered before anyone else could.
Okay, so guys, I might be on radio silence for a while. Steve, I'll meet you at the tunnel,
he said quickly. He heard Steve ask him what he was planning to do, but Bucky had no time to explain. He holstered his gun mid-run. His bionic arm reacted without him having to focus or really think about it. The only thing he needed to concentrate on was what exactly he wanted to do. His comlink went dead silent first as the electromagnetic pulse discharged from his arm. Then it reached the flying robots. They went dark in a blink and fell down, hitting the pavement right before him like rocks. It was pretty satisfying to watch, to say the least. He only looked around for a moment, but saw that almost everything darkened in his immediate vicinity as well.
I really gotta fight robots more often,
he said out loud, dropping his arm again. He didn't even think about pulling his gun from his holster again. When Steve noticed him, for a moment he looked like he wanted to yell. Bucky wasn't sure because he was still wearing his mask, but his eyes were telling. The tunnel was thankfully not a sewer. It was large and tall, so it was probably used for transportation. Bucky just hoped it was not used to store more robots or tanks or something, because then they would be screwed down here. At least he no longer had to watch out for burning rocks falling from the sky.
Took you long enough,
Steve said in the end as Bucky jogged up to them.
And why are you off the comlink?
Bucky pulled the dead earpiece out and tossed it away.
EMP,
he explained simply.
Got a replacement?
Steve asked.
You think anything electronic I had on me survived?
Bucky asked in return. Steve reached into his own belt and fished out one. He probably had at least 3 from the things. The thought made him smile. Bucky knew that he was going to kill the communicator if he had to use the EMP again, but he took it anyway.
Let's move,
Steve said then. Bucky only just now took the time to look at the girls who were standing a little further away from them in the semi-dark tunnel. Neither of them looked injured, and Bee was no longer sporting her hammer.
Their faces were grim, though.
Did I miss something? He asked.
Things on the ground got a little more heated, Steve said. The Hulk's on the move, but it still doesn't look good.
What about that barrier?
Stark's still working on it, Juyu said. And we should be up there, fighting.
We will, Steve said. We're just going to attack from another direction.
Well, they already know we're here, so how's the sneak attack gonna work? Bucky asked.
The robots seem to be acting on their own, Steve said. Stark doesn't think the other is getting any sort of information back from them.
Bucky pulled out his earpiece.
And Loki,
he asked. Bee was walking a little ahead of him, but Bucky still noticed how her gaze landed on him.
What about him?
Steve asked.
If he's the one who activated all these robots.
He didn't, Juyu said firmly. Bucky was so not about to get into an argument.
I'm not making accusations, but he's involved, Bucky said, willingly or not.
Not willingly,
the girl said even more forcefully.
He wouldn't help him.
Bucky was definitely not someone who was out for Loki's blood, but he also didn't know him well enough to blindly believe that.
It doesn't matter,
Steve said, ending the discussion.
Bucky put his communicator back in place. Jarvis has been gathering data about everything here. The tanks, the guns, the turrets, and every other robot and machinery that has been activated is too much for someone to control centrally. They're just following their programming and attack every intruder.
So we either trash them all or shut them down, Bucky concluded.
We must get behind the other's barrier for that,
Juyu said.
Okay, and how does that plan?
Bucky abruptly fell silent when the ground above them shook. There was an incredibly loud rumble, then a crash that was getting louder and louder, the sound just dragging on.
We better hurry,
he said, staring up.
What is this?
Juyu asked. Her gun was in her hand. She was completely alert and waiting for an attack.
I don't want to stick around to find out,
Steve said and started running. Bucky followed, and luckily,
The girls did too. Jarvis, is something coming for us? Steve asked. I cannot scan the area properly, Captain Rogers. I am out of reach. The AI replied. Can anyone see what the heck is happening above us? Steve asked then. I see a lot of smoke, Cap, but the fog's too thick and the buildings are high. Ruddy said. You better get the heck out of there. We're working on it, Steve told him. There was a cracking sound, breaking concrete and shifting stones. Either something incredibly heavy was moving above them, or something was digging down towards them through the ground. Neither option sounded too promising. He did not ask Jarvis how long this tunnel was or where it led, but he was sure Steve knew where he was going, so he just kept running behind him. The noise was getting even louder, and Bucky saw a large crack running on the side of the tunnel. He followed the crack with his eyes and saw that it was spreading everywhere, bigger and larger cracks appearing by the second. The tunnel's collapsing! He yelled just when dirt and rocks started falling down on them. Neither of them had to yell or warn the others more. They all picked up speed at the same time, running faster and faster. He knew how fast Steve could run, and it was not easy to keep up with him, not even Bucky. The fact that both Skrull girls were right there next to him, matching their speed, was really something. He heard larger crashes and bangs from behind him, but he did not look back to see how much of the tunnel was collapsing or whether there actually was something that came down. He just kept running until his lungs burned and his legs ached. It was such a cliche to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but he was still really relieved to see it because more and more dust filled the air and it was getting hard to see even with his goggles on. He did not hesitate to jump when he reached the exit, wanting to get away from the falling rocks that were hitting his shoulders. He felt that they were getting bigger and bigger by the second. Steve jumped too, and so did Juyu and B. Steve automatically put up his shield to cover not just himself, but Juyu too. There was nothing overly large falling on top of them, luckily, mainly just rocks and dirt. Bucky felt someone land on his legs, but it did not hurt that much. B was lying half over his shins, where she landed from her jump. They both sat up and looked back at the tunnel at the same time, only for their eyes to move slowly higher and higher and higher. There was not something digging down towards them. The abandoned tunnel collapsed under the weight, which was worse. It really was much worse. The thing wasn't even a tank. It was too enormous to be a tank. It did not roll on wheels or sprockets. It had legs. 4 of them. Or at least Bucky saw 4 at the moment. Each leg was thicker than the average steel beams used for skyscrapers on Earth, and while the whole thing was more than obviously too big and heavy to be moving around in a city, it had agility and skill not expected from something of its size. You gotta be kidding me, Juyu said behind him, and Bucky could really agree with that sentiment. We really need the Hulk here, Steve said, his voice firm and calm despite the view in front of him. The thing was getting closer. Its legs were buried in the ground when the tunnel collapsed underneath it, but it was easily making its way forward, even so. We have to run, Bucky said, still out of breath, but already getting up. No matter how tough they were, they really couldn't handle this one. Come on, let's go, he urged again. He did not want to wait and find out what sort of weapons were on this thing, or if it had any other friends nearby. But even as they started running again, the thing was approaching way too fast with its long legs and impressive speed. They needed to hide or get out of its way without being noticed. They had to... Something smashed into the giant robot from above. It was just a blur, followed by the sound of cracking and bending metal. The thing stumbled, its legs automatically trying to compensate for the impact to regain balance, but there were sparks flying from its body, and it didn't quite manage to straighten up again. Oh God, I love the Hulk. Bucky breathed out in relief as the metal monstrosity stumbled again and started to fall over. The sound of crunching metal continued, and sparks flew everywhere when the thing finally hit the ground. That's when Bucky realized that there was no roaring green figure tearing the robot apart. No smashing green beast. What he saw instead was a tall gray figure, but too slender to be Drongo. The shape wrapped 2 arms around one of the robot's legs and twisted on it, tearing it out of its place with a shout and... Holy crap, that was impressive! Kahara! Juyu yelled. Kahara's here! Bucky watched as the tall woman lifted the leg of the robot and stabbed it back into its main body. The machine seemed to struggle for a moment, but then sparks erupted from within, blowing out the golden lights on it. The woman jumped off the giant thing as more sparks exploded. She landed on the ground not that far away from them. She had a double-bladed staff on her back, which she took in her hand as she straightened up. She was huge, towered over them all with her height. She would have been intimidating all on her own, but the huge weapon in her hand and her armor just made her presence all the more commanding. What she did to the giant robot was also a whole different level of being one scary lady. Several planes or spaceships flew over them, and a moment later, more people landed on the ground, jumping down from above. All of them huge and gray, just as the woman, but maybe younger, it was hard to tell. They were definitely not as well built as Drongo. Kaera looked over to them and started to speak loudly, but Bucky couldn't understand a word from it. It was maybe a question?
They need to take down the barrier first,
Juyu yelled back, pointing at the golden shield protecting the other's ship.
And he has Loki as his prisoner.
Kaera's lips curled up angrily into something almost like a snarl. Tell her that they need to help the Hulk. Stark instructed them through the comlink. He's the only one right now standing between the tanks and Hatchet and I.
Stark needs your help,
Juyu continued yelling.
There is a green giant. You cannot miss him. You need to help him destroy all these machines.
Kaera nodded and turned back towards her companions, speaking to them in a loud but firm tone. Like a leader, they all lifted their fists or weapons in reaction, shouting their agreement or giving a battle cry. Bucky had no idea. The next moment, they were off, running with incredible speed towards the other's ship, and where no doubt the Hulk was. Bucky was staring at the giant robot that was little more than mangled scrap metal on the ground. Damn, he breathed out. Juyu and B started running after Kaera and her team, so Bucky took off as well, Steve right behind him. Bucky really thought the sneak attack was off. Hard to be quiet when you arrive right after a group of angry giants start tearing apart tanks, mainly with their bare hands. Bucky arrived just in time to see the Hulk stop after finishing up his latest target and stare at the giants for a moment. His green eyes followed how Kaera and the rest charged. Then he himself gave an enormous roar and started attacking again. The tanks, of course, not the Sakarans. The Sakarans, in return, didn't even bat an eye at the sight of the Hulk. Buggy assumed there were stranger things out in the universe than an almost 9-foot-tall green guy. The Hulk was staring at the tanks that kept pouring out from several underground entrances with renewed fervor. Bucky did not see any other four-legged giant robots, and he sincerely hoped that the last one was the only one nearby. Not that they had to worry now that their backup was here, because damn, they were impressive. He remembered that Stark told him that Drongo could probably take on the Hulk, but seeing these giants fight put that comment in a whole new perspective. Bruce's control got better and better every day, and along with that, the Hulk was more and more articulate and easier to communicate with. But he still threw himself into a fight like a beast. The Sakarans, on the other hand, were skilled warriors. It was obvious from the way they moved and waved their weapons, and Kaera was the most impressive of them all. She led the others, fought at the very front. Bucky could respect that. He did not see Stark or Hatchet, and it took but a moment to lose track of both Juyu and B as well. He and Steve stuck together in the chaos as much as possible. The meteorite shower seemed to stop for the time being, which made being out in the open slightly more bearable. The tanks roaming the area were not that huge either, but neither of them was eager to go face to face with those. They decided almost immediately to keep trying to get closer to the other's ship while the attention was mostly on the Hulk and the Sakarans. Who knew what was beyond the barrier? The other probably had actual flesh and blood soldiers on his ship, and that was something even Steve and Bucky could deal with. B, why did I just see you fly by? Stark asked suddenly. You and Juyu are supposed to stick with Cap.
I found a good concealed position,
Juyu answered right away.
I'm keeping an eye on things, don't worry.
I'll stay with Drongo,
B said calmly. Fine, Stark said, sounding a little frustrated, but not wanting to, or not having the time to argue. Just watch your backs. How's taking down the barrier going? Steve asked him. We're getting there, Stark said with a strange tilt in his voice. He means we're either going to tear it apart or blow ourselves up, Hatchet added. So we're doing as well as expected. Well, that's nice. Steve deadpanned. You'll notice when we're done, Stark said. And you all need to move immediately when we are. Search for the other and Loki. They might not be in the ship, but somewhere in the area around it. Copy that, Stark. Steve told him. We're close to the barrier. We can move in as soon as it's down. I see more enemy machines approaching us. Thor boomed, his voice loud to compensate for the wind swirling around him. Yep, I see it, Rhodey confirmed. Stay in front of them. I'm gonna attack from behind. Hide above the clouds, for they appear to focus more on the ground than the sky, Thor told him, and their wheels are most vulnerable. Got it, Rhodey told him. Their current spot gave them a pretty good view of how Thor landed on the ground with a big thud, his red cape a little battered and dirty, but still drawing attention to the Aesir as it billowed in the wind. Thor lifted his hammer up to the sky, and in only a moment, lightning was zapping down to him, the fog vanishing because of the heat and the light. Thor directed a great beam of lightning at the approaching machines. Then he himself attacked, swinging his hammer and striking them down. These vehicles did not look like the tanks from before, but they were no doubt just as sturdy and dangerous as the previous ones. You should try sealing the gates they are coming through from, Steve suggested. We did close down 2, but then just another 2 opened, Rhodey said. They seem to have tunnels everywhere, and Jarvis could barely map out some of it. So we need to take down the source, or they just keep coming, Steve said. And we cannot fight endlessly, Thor said, shouted really as he fought. We must find my brother, for he is the key. I know it. I hate to be that guy, but Bucky started. If he's the one powering or controlling these things or activating them, whatever, it might be difficult to make it stop. I mean, what if the only way is to... Finish that sentence, mortal, and I will find you and rip your tongue out of your skull! Hatchet warned him darkly, the comlink sizzling with static or possibly magic. I was not threatening him. Relax, Bucky told him. I'm just warning you. There might be complications you won't like. We'll deal with them, Stark said firmly, his tone hard and determined. Bucky was not about to start arguing with him. Stark was here to save his guy, while Steve and Bucky were mainly here to take down the other. The two were not mutually exclusive at all, so there was no reason to fight about it. Bucky said what he wanted to say, and Stark could deal with the rest. Stark didn't blow himself up. It was the barrier that came down. Maybe it was not torn apart, but it did dissolve pretty spectacularly. Steve and Bucky were running towards it even before it was fully gone, and they crossed the line that was no longer there as soon as possible. The ship itself hovered in the air, nestled between some sharp cliffs. Only when they got closer did they realize it was more of a valley, and there was also a river down far below. That made it considerably harder to approach the ship on foot. Bucky had to admit that it was clever. He had to part ways with Steve when they got close because they found 2 separate pathways that seemed to lead closer to the ship, and they did not want to pick just one. Bucky had yet to see anyone else, friend or foe, so it seemed like he was completely alone. Only the sound of the battle in the distance reminded him that this was not the case at all. He kept his footsteps quiet as he moved forward, not wanting to alert any possible enemies. He was surprised that there were no turrets or guns or robots here like they seemed to be everywhere else around the city. Why wouldn't the other surround himself with as many of the machines as possible? Why not have any inside the barrier? He couldn't have been that cocky. Bucky stopped abruptly when he saw a dark shape up on the top of a nearby cliff. More of a lookout, really. It gave a great view of both the city and the field down below where the battle still raged. Bucky never saw the other before, not from up close, but it had to be him. And he was outside of his ship. Bucky craned his neck and shifted silently to get a closer look, not wanting to alert everyone without being sure. That's when the other figure caught his eyes. Half crumbled to the ground, kneeling on the hard stone, pale and half-bared, chained, completely motionless. Bucky moved forward some more to have a better look. Found him. Found Loki, he whispered, but he knew that everyone would be able to hear it. Sure enough, his communicator exploded with noise as almost everyone seemed to ask him a question at once, but Bucky could not answer, because the other turned around, clearly alerted, even by the hushed words. Bucky was up and running immediately, because no way in hell was he going to attack some all-powerful alien all on his own. He was smarter than that. He ran, but he didn't get far. When he felt a presence behind him, he moved to dodge, avoid getting grabbed or hit. He was just a tad too slow. The hand grabbed his bionic arm, so it did not hurt, but he did fly through the air in the next moment, getting tossed away like a rag doll. He hit the ground with a hard smack, landing on hard stone. Rocks were digging into his back, and he felt a little dizzy. He knew it was not that serious, but it was still not really pleasant. He jumped to his feet quickly and turned around to face his attacker. Steve was shouting in his ear, asking him what the heck was going on. Bucky would have loved to know that himself. He stared at Loki, his neck covered in angry red marks, his long hair in a tangled mess, his tattered trousers damp with water or blood, the heavy shackles around his wrists with long chains hanging off of them. What made him stare was not any of that but his eyes. The look. That look he saw before, he knew it well. Being unmade. This is what that looked like. Complications, he said quietly, not sure if it was going to be his very last word or not.